Good morning, everybody. Let's get started this morning. My name is Paul Salem, President of the Middle East Institute. Welcome, and thanks for joining us here today. A number of other people will be coming in. There seems to be some event in DC, and Connecticut Avenue is largely closed down. I'm not sure what public event is going on, but very happy to have everybody here. This is a launch event for one of our books that was recently published by the Middle East Institute called Escaping the Conflict Trap Towards Ending Civil Wars in the Middle East. And it was co-edited with my colleague Ross Harrison, who's with us here today as well. And a number of the authors of this book are on the panels that we see today. Obviously, there are 5 ongoing civil wars in the Middle East today that have taken tremendous tolls at the humanitarian level, but also produced tremendous security and political disorder in the region. This book first looks at sort of the modern history of civil wars. These are not the first civil wars in the Middle East. We look at 14 other civil wars in the region and try to examine what are the underlying drivers and the causes that see this outbreak of civil wars. Partly it's the result of failures of nation states, the challenge to those sort of fairly new institutions in the Middle East. When they break down, they often break down into civil war. It also certainly indicates dysfunctions at the economic level in terms of unemployment and the needs, social and economic needs of people, as well as great dysfunction at the political level, no real political inclusion, high levels of repression. We also in the book look at the external factors. The Middle East itself, you could say, is going through a regional civil war itself, particularly between Iran and Saudi Arabia and some other countries, as well as Turkey, in some cases Israel. The region is at war with itself, let alone the massive incursions we've seen from the US or from recently Russia as well. So we try to look at all these dynamics. We focus on 5 civil wars, which are Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Libya, and Iraq. Iraq has been maybe in an on-again, off-again civil war, but we look at Iraq as well. And this book has tried to bring together both sort of theorists, academics, researchers, as well as practitioners, diplomats, and people who've actually tried to resolve these civil wars. A number of them are on the panels today. They wrote chapters in this book. At the end of the day, as a think tank, we are trying to contribute to the practical goal of finding ways to actually end these civil wars. And that reflects a little bit the structure of our panels this morning. We have 2 panels. In the first panel, we will look at the country level. We will look at Yemen, we will look at Afghanistan, we will look at Libya, and try to look at the complexities and the dynamics in those particular conflicts and what are potential pathways to de-escalate and potentially at some point to resolve those civil wars. And we will look in that first panel, as I said, on at the national, local level, as it were. In the second panel, we are pulling back to look at some of the drivers, some of the regional and international dynamics, some of the conditions that could either help externally bring about an end to these civil wars, or sustain a peace once it's created, or prevent other countries, Lebanon, Bahrain, from falling into civil wars. As I said, these weren't the only civil wars in the region. They're not likely to be the last civil wars in the region. So I really look forward to the conversations of these 2 panels. To get us started, moderating our first panel is our good friend, Dr. Dan Serwer. Dr. Serwer is an MEI scholar, but he's also the director of the Conflict Management Program at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies next door. Dan is a senior fellow at its Center for Transatlantic Relations. His current interests focus on civilian instruments needed to protect U.S. national security, as well as transition and state building in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Balkans. He's had tremendous experience in dealing with conflict, conflict management, conflict abatement in the Balkans, and a lot of experience in the Middle East and Iraq and other places, so brings a lot of expertise to this conversation. And Dan, thanks for joining us today. Before getting started, I do want to mention that we will, as has become our habit, be using technology to integrate your comments and questions into the conversation. We are using an app or a website. Actually, you don't need to download an app called Menti. So you go to www.menti.com. That's MENTI, Menti, MENTI.com. That will be up on the screen soon. And you use the code 55415. Once you're on that site, you can join the conversation. You upload questions. The questions will go directly to the moderator, will be hopefully injected directly into the conversation. So we found a very good way to have a broad conversation with a lot of people in the room. Also on that website, if you see a question you like, you can like it, which means it goes up in the priority of questions that Dan is looking at on his screen. Otherwise, please put your phones on silent. We are recording this event. We will put it on our website as video later once it's finished and edited. Thanks again for joining us. And Dan, the floor is yours.
We'll hope that works. I'm not going to do detailed biographic introductions of my friends here and remotely in New Haven, Connecticut. But I will say that these are among the very finest experts on these countries anywhere in the world. And they all have many years of experience working on these issues. I'm looking forward to hearing from them. And I'm looking forward in particular hearing from them about what they think the future scenarios might look like in each of these countries. Give me a probability, if you can, of how likely each scenario is. And then briefly tell me what the driving forces are that either prevent a good solution or create the conditions for one. It seems to me that is done in the book, which, by the way, is an extraordinary piece of work. It has a much deeper historical context than you normally find in discussions of these issues. In the end, the test for all of us is, can we do something about it? We're going to start with Robert Ford, who has class he has to teach at 10:15, so he's going to abandon us a few minutes before that with Syria. We'll then go to Jerry Feierstein on Yemen, to Marvin Weinbaum on Afghanistan, to Jonathan Weiner on Libya. And I will have to attempt in a few words to substitute for Rhonda Slim, who's been ill on Iraq. Robert?
Good morning, Dan. Good morning to people there. Shall I go ahead? Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you, Robert, and the floor is yours.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm going to speak just very briefly about how the Syrian Civil War could end, and then drivers behind the conflict. I'm going to speak about two drivers in particular. First, Syrian Civil War now is basically down to two areas outside of Syrian government control. And those are the two I'm going to speak about. First is northwest Syria, where there's fighting now. Turkey has just sent in troops. There's an offensive underway by the Syrian government, backed by Russia and Iran. This isn't new. This area has been the scene of fighting for years. The longer-term trend, however, is clear that the Syrian government is going to retake most, if not all of it. May not happen this month, probably won't. Might not happen this year, 2020. Might be 2021. The only question is, will there be some kind of a safe zone in northwest Syria, in Idlib, where literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Syrian refugees will take shelter, and the fighting comes to a sort of a ceasefire with perhaps a safe zone, perhaps not. And I would expect Russia would broker between Turkey and the Syrian government that final deal. So that leaves then the second area outside of Syrian government control, and that's eastern Syria, where there are still some hundreds of American troops. I don't think the President of the United States wants to keep there forever. And I think the longer term likelihood is one of two things. Either the Americans leave and turn over the area to the Syrian government and Russian forces, which is to say that they turn over to the Russians and the Syrians responsibility for controlling territory, keeping ISIS contained, or in the absence of a deal with the Russians and through them the Syrian government, then there will be increased pressure on the Americans from the Syrian government, from Iran, probably from Russia as well, in sort of an unconventional warfare scenario where they're trying to drive American casualties up and force the Americans out that way. And the Russians will increase their own pressure with China and others in venues like the United Nations Security Council to undermine the legitimacy of the American remaining presence in Syria. In either scenario, the Americans leave sooner or later. And the Syrian government returns to these areas. Just want to make it clear to people, it doesn't mean that there won't be any fighting after that in Syria. I think it's important to think of a country like Algeria in the 1990s, where there were still occasional attacks, terror attacks, fighting between the Algerian army and Islamist rebels in the mountains. And I expect there'll be fighting in very isolated, contained fighting in places like southern Syria and Dara province, maybe between Islamist extremists and Syrian and Russian forces in central and eastern Syria. But it'll be isolated. There won't be front lines. It'll be, days of quiet and then a day of fight, quiet again. It's going to take a long time for this to occur. The Syrian government doesn't have resources to clamp down firmly everything. But Assad stays in power, and by his definition, he wins. I don't say that happily, but that was his objective from the start, and he will have met his objective. So let me just say a couple quick things about. First, one of the biggest drivers of this conflict has been the Assad government's refusal to compromise on anything resembling power sharing. It was never the intention of the United States to bring down the Assad government by force. We always wanted to get a negotiation for transitional national unity government. we failed. So Assad's refusal to compromise, even now, will make it hard to bring a resolution to eastern Syria. It's complicating a final deal between the Syrian Kurdish PYD party and its militia that leads the Syrian Democratic Force. The Russians are trying to broker that deal now, and it's difficult because the Assad government won't compromise. So that's going to be a continuing driver that'll actually extend the war. Foreign intervention is the second driver I'd like to mention. I don't think there's any question the intervention of foreign states has prolonged the fighting. I include in that a Russian-Iranian intervention. I also include in that Turkish, American, Qatari, Saudi Arabian intervention. But at the same time, I have to say that the Russians are now best placed to negotiate final deals to achieve ceasefires and maybe even longer duration agreements in the remaining areas of big, which are northwest Syria, Libya, and northeast Syria. I'm going to stop there, Dan. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Robert. Jerry.
Do I? Yeah. You can try. We'll stick with what works. I'm gonna turn your question a little bit on its head, Dan, and begin with what I think are the drivers of the conflict, and then come to what I believe might be the scenarios for an end state. The point that I've made in my chapter on Yemen in the book is that, in my view, the experience that we've had since 2014 with this outbreak of violence is only the latest in a cycle of violence that has plagued Yemen at least since the 1960s, with the Republican revolt against the Imamate, which dragged on until 1970, and then the establishment of the Republic. But what we've seen since then has been a continuation of this cycle of violence, internal disruption, instability inside of Yemen, primarily driven, in my view, by the inability of the society to address problems of political disenfranchisement, economic insecurity, instability, corruption, and a host of other issues that have provoked these violent responses to these perceived inequity and real inequities in Yemeni society. And so what we've had, even though in the 2011-2012 period of the Arab Spring, there was a concerted effort by the political leaders, civil society, and others to try to create a framework for addressing those problems. At the end, the forces that were promoting instability and insecurity were able to use shortcomings in the process in order to drive Yemen into yet another round of conflict and civil war. The second driver that I believe is a critical factor in why we have been in this conflict situation is the failure of the society over these past 60 years to really build the institutional capacity on either the security and law and order side or on the governance side that would allow the society to basically control its territory and prevent these outbreaks of violence. And so these, I think, are the two key factors. Now, there's a Western narrative, a Washington narrative about the civil conflict in Yemen that looks primarily at Yemen as the result of foreign intervention, foreign interference in Yemen's internal affairs, primarily a competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran that plays out in Yemen. And it's not to say that that's not a factor, that competition doesn't exist. It does. But in my view, that competition exacerbates the internal problems inside of Yemen. It is not the cause of insecurity or civil conflict in Yemen. And therefore, my view has been that it is within the capability of the Yemeni people themselves in order to find the path out of this conflict, and that regardless of the Saudi or Iranian positions, the Yemenis have that capability and that capacity when they decide to use it. So where does that lead us? It kind of leads us to the three scenarios that have generally been discussed. The first scenario is that one side or the other actually succeeds militarily. That either the Houthis succeed in capturing the territory of Yemen and establish a government on their own, or alternatively, that the Saudi-led coalition is able to ultimately defeat the Houthi movement and force Yemen to go back to the situation status quo ante, status quo prior to 2014. I don't believe that that's a plausible scenario. I don't think that either side has demonstrated the capability of defeating the other. And therefore, what we've seen, of course, is a relatively stalemated situation, really since 2015 or 2016, that neither side has been able to gain the upper hand. Now, what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is a renewed push by the Houthis to try to expand the territory of their control in the country. They've had some successes in Madab, in Al Jawf in the north, as well as in the south. But my own view is that that's not necessarily related to their expectation that they can succeed militarily. It is rather their interest in expanding their area of control as a prelude to participation in a political negotiation. The second scenario that was popular and much discussed early on in the civil conflict is that Yemen would end up divided again between North and South, and that you would have a return to a kind of status quo pre-1962 of a Zaydi Shia dominated northern Yemen and a Sunni dominated South Yemen that would more or less follow the lines of the pre-1990 division between North and South Yemen. Again, I don't think that that is a likely scenario for a variety of reasons. One, particularly significant, is that for the Saudis, that would be a terrible outcome. They would end up with a Hezbollah-like entity on their southern border, and I think that from an existential standpoint, the Saudis would never accept that as an outcome. They, unlike their Emirati partners from time to time, the Saudis have been fairly clear in saying that one of their absolute red lines in Yemen is that Yemen end up as a unified state and not a state that would permit either IRGC or Hezbollah to have a strong role and be a continuous threat to their border. So I think that it's unlikely. We saw again in December the ability of the Saudis to force a compromise between the Hadi government and the southern separatists to paper over their differences and to move forward. And I would anticipate that is going to continue to be the most likely outcome of this conflict. So that leaves us with the third scenario, which is some kind of a compromise situation, a deal that would be brokered primarily by the United Nations, and that would allow for some kind of a coalition government in Sana'a, an end to the major fighting, so that Saudi military intervention would come to an end, Houthi aggression would come to an end, the siege of Taz would end, and there would be some kind of de-escalation, if not an actual peace between the two sides, and they would go forward and presumably begin to look at reviving some of the political strategies that were being pursued prior to the fall of 2014, the implementation of the GCC initiative, and other efforts to address some of these underlying issues, some of these drivers of conflict. So I think that that's the most likely scenario for what's going to come out. But I'm going to echo Robert here in one aspect, and that is that while I think that that is the most likely scenario for ending the big war, one should not anticipate that it will bring peace or stability to Yemen. I think that what we're likely to see is a period of prolonged instability, prolonged internal conflict, lower level, more localized. The conflict of the last 5 years has triggered a number of local conflicts, smaller conflicts that are going to take a long time to address. And as well as issues like the war economy that's developed, a number of people who've done very well out of the last 5 years and who have little interest in seeing a return or the establishment of a secure environment inside of Yemen. And the other aspect that will be important is once you have some kind of a broad agreement, what is Yemen going to do to try to address again this principal underlying factor in this long period of instability, and that is the political disenfranchisement, the economic problems, the corruption issues, the lack of institutional capacity, because if you don't begin to address those in a final resolution, all you're going to do is delay the onset of yet another cycle of violence, yet another outbreak of conflict within Yemen. So I will stop there.
With Marvin and Jonathan's permission, I'm going to interrupt for a moment. First, for a commercial announcement, I'm getting lots of good questions here, but we can have more. It's menti.com that you go to, and the code you use is 55415. Robert, before you escape us, I thought I would ask you two questions that have appeared here on my iPad or whatever that is. One is, what do you see as the most probable option for stability in Syria? And what is the U.S. or international role in this scenario? And the second question is, what are the prospects for a war between Iran and Israel on Syrian territory?
Let me do the second question first. I don't think there's going to be a war between Israel and Iran in Syria beyond what we have now, which is a sort of Israeli mowing of the Iranian grass pretty regularly. A full-scale war would necessarily involve Russia. The Russians don't want that. They have good relations with Israel, Putin and Netanyahu, for example. But they also have very good relations with the Syrian government. Putin was just in Damascus. And they don't want a war between Israel and Iran in Syria to destabilize Assad. And I think the Israelis would rather mow Iranian grass with Russian blessing than escalate full scale. On the second, the other question about stability of Syria, I think the repressive nature of the Syrian government is going to prevent the country from ever being fully stable. It's certainly going to hinder uh, Western and possibly even Gulf funding for reconstruction. I can't imagine the World Bank is going to get involved in reconstruction of Syria, for example. I don't know if the Kuwait fund will. I doubt there's going to be a lot of official Emirati money or Saudi money, maybe some private money. But the reconstruction of Syria is going to be painfully slow, decades. And the bad economic situation on top of unresolved but repressed political grievances and social grievances suggest to me that it's never going to be very, very stable, which is why I said I thought there was going to be kind of a low level of fighting, isolated incidents, assassinations, things like that. The American role, frankly, I don't think we can change the Syrian government. I have never thought the American military presence in eastern Syria would extract political concessions from the Assad government. It's about political reform. And so I think we just have to be very realistic about the limits of American leverage when other countries like Russia and Iran and even Turkey are willing to face genuine combat situations.
Thank you very much, Robert. And I think it's time for you to go to class.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. It's been great having you with us electronically. Marvin?
My pleasure. Take care.
Thank you. The current conflict in Afghanistan, which began really in after 9/11, is the most recent of a series of civil wars dating back to 78, 1975 conceivably, because there was a rebellion then. So it's really successive civil wars which has kept this country in conflict these 45 years. They all had two elements in common. In every one of them, there was an Islamic challenge to the state. The other is in every one of them, there was outside involvement. And those, of course, are elements which have to be factored into any sense here about how this can end. But let me suggest now a few scenarios about what, if not end, at least where we could see things going. The first is, and they vary here in probability and desirability. The first of these is what we would all like to see. Certainly the United States and its allies and the Kabul government would like to see this as the ideal solution. And that is, of course, power sharing. The Taliban decide that with the right kind of tweaking of the Constitution and other changes and more Islamic, essentially, with that we can sit together, the Taliban can meld into the political system, be a political party, sit in the parliament, have governors, cabinet members. That's what we like as our desired scenario. In a little while, I'm going to suggest why I don't think that's not only not going to happen, but may be impossible. Now, the second are that there's a winner in this civil war. We can pretty much rule out, it seems, everybody agrees, there's not going to be a military solution if the government and the international community that supports it are going to prevail. It's just, maybe it could have happened 15 years ago or even 10 years ago, but certainly not today, given who controls what and the way they're ensconced. So that's not going to happen. But that doesn't mean there can't be a political victory. And that would require essentially that the government's elements, the elements that make up the political class and so on, all get together. They become the unity government that they're labeled as. And they, given 3-5 years or so, maybe longer, but we've bought time in which they can put their act together. And in doing so, you don't get reconciliation with the Taliban. You get reintegration of its fighting elements. Not the hardcore, because they're always going to be difficult. But you can marginalize them if the fighters see a better deal, so that time is seen on the side of the government rather than on the side of the insurgency. The other victory is a Taliban victory. And here people don't write off as quickly. We all say there is no military victory, but the Taliban have never said that. They think that is an option, and with some reason, given the lay of the land at this point. So for them, there can be a military solution, and they see things. Certainly the commanders on the ground say, look, we've been fighting all this time. We don't want a cabinet position. We want an Islamic State. I'll come back to that in a moment. So it might take a long time. They may never really fully get there, but that certainly is a scenario that is feasible. Now, the final scenario is the least desirable, certainly, and not improbable. And that is the state collapses from within as well as from without. And there's enough disunity now here to make that a very strong option for some people who will. They're fighting among themselves now. The only thing they haven't done is to take up arms against one another. They've done everything but that. And what I'm talking about here is a prolonged, bloody civil war of another character, which is much more chaotic, in which there is not one side and the other side, but the Taliban, who are not entirely unified, and the government on its side and its supporters, warlords, militias, all fighting one another. And we've seen that happen between 1992 and 1995, when there was a chaotic civil war. But this would be on a much greater scale. And the countries in the area, as they did in the 1980s, jump in supporting their proxies, because they all have a stake in the outcome. That kind of civil war is what everyone dreads. But it's all too possible. Okay, now what are the drivers here? I think there are three. One is something we're watching very closely now. What does the United States and its allies do? If we wipe our hands of this, as we might very well do, I might say, with the cover of a political settlement, or simply unilaterally. If we do that, what is going to happen is the Afghan security forces are going to unravel. Particularly if we pull out our air support. That's the most crucial element. Yes, the others are important. The logistics, the intelligence, the training, of course, but it's the air power. If that isn't in place, the fighting forces in Afghanistan are going to go home, and they're likely to join the militias and thereby add to the ingredients for a civil war. So what we do. The other is what the Taliban would do. And maybe I'll condense this. I think what's really the sticking factor here is that we've had all these civil wars, this one more than any of the others, because of the players, because of the international involvement. This has turned into an existential civil war in which you have elements who, it may be said, cannot resolve their differences. On one side, you have those who have the notion here of constitutional, pluralistic, liberal form of government. On the other side, which is beholden ultimately to the popular will. On the other side, you have people for whom the answers already are in the book. You don't need that kind of input. You don't need those structures. In fact, those structures are totally alien to us. This must be a Sharia state. And the Taliban, not to mention Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, have stated they will not settle for anything but an Islamic state. Now that can be defined in certain ways, but they have in these negotiations not budged one iota on their core principles. So here we have a situation where if we know anything about existential fights, for example, we don't talk about negotiating with Al-Qaeda or with Islamic State. That never entered the dialogue because we know those differences are irreconcilable. We may be in that kind of situation now, despite the fact that the Taliban throw us bones which suggest that maybe there's something other than that. So let me end with saying it may be that the kind of Afghanistan that I first saw when I got there 50 years ago now, exactly 50 years ago, well, January of 1970, may never reappear. It may very well be that these 45 years since we saw the first of these string of civil wars, that in these 45 years, there has developed a culture of violence, a culture of fighting here, which, and the criminal element of it, of course, is very important, and that's another subject, that this is going to be the foreseeable future for Afghanistan. The best we can do as an international community is to mitigate that in every way we can. And it's in our interest to do so, because if Afghanistan fails, the region will fail, and ultimately the global powers will pay as well.
Jonathan.
I've been very impressed by the discussion this morning so far about the omnipotence of the United States and the effectiveness of our policies over the decades in achieving peace, justice, freedom, and opportunity in the world. This is also true of our experience in Libya. I'd like to leave the American perspective first and try to go to the drivers of the conflict from inside Libya and the drivers of the conflict from outside Libya. Inside Libya, when they finally get rid of Gaddafi after 42 years, everybody's got a grievance, except those who are very close to him. The winners under the old system actually have a grievance too, since they're not going to have as much as they used to have. Everybody else wants more than they used to have. So there's a big struggle for control of the resources and the wealth. The only way you get to institution building in such a situation is if you have other countries, people that can affect Libyans' lives, all saying you guys got to work together. And from time to time, the outside world did that, and from time to time, the outside world said, "No, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to be your patron." You had competing so from the inside, you had tremendous grievance, in particular in the East, which had never, from its point of view, gotten its fair share in the Gaddafi years. Gaddafi being from Sirte and favoring Tripolitania, given the national capital being there. And that the oil gets pumped out mostly through the east, so from their point of view, more is necessary for us. So as a result, you had a failure of institution building as they squabbled, and eventually you had foreign states decide, hey, there are opportunities for us if we act, and there are risks if we don't, and let's look at what the opportunities were. Egypt had a Muslim Brotherhood government. The Emiratis looked at that and said, we don't really like that very much. And the Emiratis engaged and played a very substantial role. I'll just leave it at that for now, but a very substantial role in helping secure a government much more to its liking. Well, having done that in Egypt, why not do it in Libya as well, from the Emirati point of view? So the Emiratis have periodically, since the Libyan revolution, used military force. I remember in 2014, we were referring to mirages in the desert. And the mirages we were talking about were not shimmers of light, but airplanes. And from time to time, the Emiratis have gone in the Obama administration. Our goal was to get everybody aligned, to tell the Libyans, you can't fight, you have to compromise, and you have to have a compromised government. The problem is that some governments in the region don't really necessarily want compromised governments or political pluralism. They may be happier with dictators or ruling families, and they may be happier with the Gaddafi-like model than a politically pluralistic model that is potentially unstable and could change and could involve Muslim Brotherhood characteristics. Now, by contrast, if you're Turkey, you may say, well, gee, we really like that Muslim Brotherhood justice and construction thing, works for us, and we've got economic interests, including oil interests, in the Mediterranean too, and we're being squeezed out. So you have external power competition between the Emiratis driving it and Egypt on one side, and the Turks on and to some extent, much less, but some extent ideologically, from the Qataris. And the U.S. role was, in the Obama years, to tell everybody, stop it, you all have to pull together and give the Libyans some kind of pluralistic regime. And for a while, that kind of sort of worked with the creation of the GNA. Obama administration's gone. Trump administration is not engaged in trying to secure that outcome, and might even like a reliable dictator, if they could get there. Enter Khalifa Haftar, who spent decades out in the wilderness of Langley, Virginia, and Reston, Virginia, and thereabouts. Isn't respected when he comes back to Libya at the time of the revolution. Doesn't have declares a coup. People laugh at him. He did the same thing Gaddafi did, different result. And he's trying to change the arc of history in order to have it erase the Gaddafi years and have it be me instead of him. And so Haftar wants to be that LCC Gaddafi figure who controls Libya. That's his goal. The Emiratis have been supporting him on it. The Turks have been opposing him on it. And Russia has seen a gigantic opportunity because of the United States' lack of involvement. So if you, it would have seen an opportunity anyway. Where the United States withdrawal, it's particularly there. So what you now have is internal grievance, efforts to grab the resources internally rather than share them, and mistrust, and external powers inflaming the conflict, supporting the various sides. I haven't talked about the South. That's a long, complicating factor, but let's leave that alone. The one big opportunity is when the Islamic State came in 2015. Everybody said, this is horrible. We have to pull together to get rid of the Islamic State. With the Islamic State gone, they could start squabbling again, internally and externally. No longer had their minds concentrated by the prospects of a hanging. So three scenarios. Those are what I see as the drivers: economic, political, ideological. So what are the three scenarios? Scenario one is Haftar takes Tripoli, supported by Russian snipers and forces on the ground, the Wagner Group, which Putin says I don't control, but of course he does. It's one of the many lies that are being told right now about Libya by foreign governments, and supported by Emirati drones and air power, with whatever else the mercenaries from Sudan are doing, whatever else the French are doing, whatever else the Saudis are doing, whatever the Egyptians are facilitating, and so on. By the way, Egypt knows better, and I actually have hopes that Egypt can play a very constructive role. Believe it or not, I believe it. They're close enough to Libya that they understand reality. So scenario one is Haftar takes it with all that foreign support. The Turks don't go all in. The Turks, for whatever reason, cut a separate deal with Mr. Putin, decide to get some other advantage in some other part of the Mediterranean and let it happen. Haftar takes it and the rest of the Libyans give up, other than some on the ground, and we have a Syria-type situation in which one side wins, and then there's years and years of cleanup and mess. And I give that maybe a 15% chance, even if Haftar survives some years well into his 90s or hundreds. Scenario two is there's a political agreement, as we saw brokered in Moscow, a successful political agreement that was supposed to happen there, except Haftar refused to sign. We saw it again in Berlin, brokered by Merkel, with tremendous effort by the Germans, who did a really great job, an impeccable job. And what happened? There wasn't even a pause, let alone a ceasefire. Promised pause, it didn't happen. Nothing happened. They just kept on. Everybody who committed not to provide more weapons and more military support, as near as I can tell, continued to do it within hours or minutes after their declarations that they'd stop. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I'm seeing from a distance, is they're all continuing to do it. So scenario two is they get tired of the fight and they go into alignment and they insist on some kind of compromise deal. The Emiratis would have to decide. That was what they really wanted, among others. Egypt could potentially get them there if Egypt thinks further about it and finds alternatives to a family-based rule, which is Haftar's goal. Third scenario is partition. Sounds an awful lot like the Yemen scenarios that Ambassador Firestein just described. And partition would be de facto control of different parts of the country by different forces. The East grabbing as much oil as it can. Most of the oil resources are in the East, and getting permission from internationals, at least from Russia, the Emirates and so on. Russia blocks in the Security Council to start exporting the oil. And you have a country that is de facto partitioned for the foreseeable future, with Turkey pushing its oil and gas deals with the government in the West. So I view that 15%, 35%, 30% maybe for a deal, 20-25% partition, and the rest is just stalemate for the foreseeable future. What could change all of this? If the United States decided that it really wanted to engage and to push very hard, maybe the United States could still make a difference. We still have the ability, of course, to counter terrorism. We have the ability to embarrass through being transparent about what we know about what foreign governments are doing. We could bring that up in the UN Security Council and make big issues about what foreign countries were doing. The Turks appear to be bringing in Syrian fighters to Libya. I'm not sure that's a really good idea. I think it's a terrible idea. It's as bad an idea, at least, as the Russians bringing in mercenaries from Wagner to assassinate people with snipers. I don't think Libyans really want to be seeing a lot of other Libyans killed by foreigners. There's stuff to work with there that could attenuate the conflict and potentially help good actors like the Germans secure something. But it would require some leadership. I don't think we're going to get it right now from Boris Johnson. I don't think Mr. Macron demonstrated tremendous capacity when he invited Haftar to become a diplomat, and Haftar pretended to be one for a nanosecond while he was in Paris. I don't think the Italians covered themselves in glory when they allowed Haftar to kidnap their process. Germans are really the only ones right now, from my point of view, deserve a halo, to wear a halo, and they do. So I don't know if the United States can do that or not. I'm hoping that for this year at least, things don't get worse, and I'm very concerned about further escalation by the foreigners. If the foreigners want to fight over Libya, that could go on for a very long time. Thank you.
My thanks to all of you so far. I'm going to try to fill in on Iraq just for a moment. I think there are two important scenarios. One is one in which the U.S., even with troops still in Iraq, essentially abandons the field, limits its troops to training special forces to fight terrorists, and doesn't seek political influence in Iraq because it thinks it's hopeless. Under that scenario, the Iranians gain a great deal. They gain Iraq. And, but that's only if Iraq holds together in that scenario. And I think there's a very serious possibility that the Sunni and Kurds would say, wait, this isn't an Iraq we can deal with. So it's a scenario basically leading towards either civil war, partition, or both. The other possibility is, frankly, that Iraq muddles through, as it has so far. It has a semi-democratic system. It has been governing itself for some time now, and in ways that are not entirely autocratic. I mean, I can't describe it as a democracy. It's still an anocracy, a transition between an autocracy and a democracy, but it does have significant potential for muddling through, and I think that's a serious possibility. The factors that I would cite that are most important are external powers, especially the United States and Iran, and the elite ability to make a pact that satisfies not only themselves, but to some extent the demonstrators as well, because the popular demonstrations have become a serious factor in Iraq. So elite pacting and external powers, to me, are the driving forces in Iraq. Now I'm going to turn to questions. You've given me lots and lots of questions. I'm going to try to be fair about the distribution of them, but I probably won't ask any Syria questions at this point. I'll try to make them serious questions, but not Syria questions, because Robert is no longer with us. Let me start really what Jonathan left off. In a way, he's already answered this question, but it's an important one. What is your best case for a realistic scenario in 2020? And what should the U.S. and the international players be doing to bring about that best case? I'll start with you, Jonathan, because it follows directly on from your last remark.
Sure. The U.S. should both assert and swallow its pride at the same time. By asserting its pride, the U.S. should get involved directly in trying to cause a cessation of military help from outside to the various forces and to push for a ceasefire. That would require the U.S. to go to the Emiratis and say, stop now, there will be consequences if you keep this up, period. The United States would have to go to Russia and say, what do you want here? What do you want? What can we potentially give you in order to get peace? And if there is nothing, then we're going to be on opposite sides and it's going to get a lot worse. And we'll consider the alternatives. Some version of that. I mean, that's fairly naked, but some version of that. We go to Turkey to say, if we can get the Emiratis and the Russians to stop, are you prepared to verifiably stop and to get those Syrian fighters out of the country before you get a really serious terrorism problem reemerging? And so on. Build out from there. And then get the good players to try and help bring the Algerians in to support the notion of non-interference in the Maghreb, at least. And that would be the initiative. You would also work very, very hard on the economic side for some formulas for revenue sharing at the local level with the municipalities, potentially with payments made to individual Libyans, part of the process. There's a lot of economic things you can do, but you have to get the outside countries to agree to stop the war. Thank you.
Marvin, I'm going to add another question for you because there are a lot of votes for it.
So you don't want a response to?
No, I do want a response to that one. I do want a response. What should the U.S. do to make things come out as best we can in the next year? But I want you to also answer what happens to women and girls in a scenario in which the Taliban become a partner in power sharing.
Unfortunately, the best outcome is at the moment probably the least probable. The best outcome is that, as I suggested, the conditions are created for a stability here, which gives the political players here time to make the kinds of reforms, to take the kinds of measures which are going to be necessary to regain the confidence of the Afghan people, which they haven't completely lost, but nevertheless, there's something to build on here because they don't want the Taliban. That's clear too. They know what that is like to. I was there when the Taliban controlled Kabul, and it was a ghost town. They don't want that. Okay, what do we have to do? And this is why I don't think it's going to happen, aside from whether they can put their act together. It would mean our recommitment to Afghanistan, and that's going to anger a lot of people. Say, wait a second, we've been there for 18 years. Now you're saying we got to have a recommitment? Yeah, but hopefully we've learned some lessons in that time. And we should have also come to understand that without our involvement there, we cannot buy that time for them to do what's necessary. As far as the women are concerned, there are mixed signals here. They say a lot of the right things, but if we look at what's happening out in the districts around the country where they do control, they're setting a very poor example of what the future will look like. Even when they were in control during the latter part of the 1990s, when they were in full control, they always said, oh yes, we're not against women's education, but the caveat is always this: we'll do it, but we'll do it on our terms. That's the key phrase. We're for democracy, but our terms. So women, let me conclude though, we're missing one very important group here. I think a terribly important group. The millions of Afghans who have returned to the country, young people by and large, who have gotten educations, who have made over these 20 years nearly an investment in this country. There is a extent of human capital here which has never existed anything like it in Afghanistan before. There is here people who have a stake in this outcome, and if it does not succeed, they're not going to be hanging around. They won't get a chance to when the Taliban take over, in effect. They'll all be refugees, and we can look at upwards, I think, of 10 million refugees. Think of that in terms of what we've been going through recently, because we had 5 million when the population was half the size it is now. So I'm simply doubling it.
Yeah, Jerry, I want to add a question for you. I want you to talk about what should be done in the next year to make things come out as best we can. But there's also a related question. Is the U.S. being responsible about arms transfers to its friends? And should that be cut off?
Okay, well, I will stick with your first question and say, in fairness, I was a little bit more optimistic in December than I am today, but I still believe that realistically we could see some kind of an agreement to end, as I said, to end the big conflict in Yemen. And particularly the conflict that has drawn in the Saudis and the Saudi coalition on the side of the Hadi government. So I do believe that Martin Griffiths has the capability to broker some kind of a deal that would allow for the parties to go back to Sana'a, to resume political negotiation, to move forward, to create some kind of a coalition, a multi-party government that would be able to hold things together for a period of time, depending on where we went forward on it. I think that the Saudis have a strong interest in helping to bring that kind of a brokered arrangement to fruition. Primarily because, one, I think that the Saudis themselves have become tired of this conflict and recognize that it's been a huge drain and a distraction from what they believe are their priorities on domestic policy. And secondly, because the Saudis, who will be hosting the G20 conference in Riyadh later this year, will have an interest in clearing the deck on some of these outstanding issues to ensure that this G20 conference, which is their step onto the global stage, is going to be a success. So I think that they would love to see Martin Griffiths succeed. Where does the United States come in on this? I think that that the U.S., which has been largely absent from the Yemen political dialogue since the end of the Obama administration. Remember that John Kerry was working on Yemen pretty much up to the day that he stepped down from office. This administration has subcontracted our Yemen policy to the Saudis and the Emiratis. I think that that's been a mistake on our part, that we have interest and that we have a capacity as a convener to help resolve this conflict, and we should be more aggressive at a more senior level, at least at the Pompeo level, to try to push this through. We, along with the UK, can use the Friends of Yemen framework to try to promote greater international engagement. And again, remember that in my view, the drivers of this conflict are internal, the political marginalization, the economic marginalization, and that in order to resolve these drivers of conflict in Yemen, we have to address that. That's going to fall largely on the shoulders of the international community, and the United States is going to have to be a leader in generating that kind of international consensus on how to move forward, how to help the Yemenis reestablish some kind of stability, some kind of an economic horizon that will keep the country from simply sliding back into conflict again. Now, in terms of the military relationship that we have primarily with the Saudis, but also with the Emiratis, I would have to say that I'm a bit of an outlier here in Washington, D.C., because I've never believed, never supported the idea that we should be using our 75-year-old military relationship with Saudi Arabia as a stick to beat the Saudis. One, because I don't disagree with the Saudis in terms of their perception of the threat to Saudi Arabia's stability that would be posed by a Houthi victory, a military victory in Yemen. While we can criticize, and we should criticize, the way that the Saudis have implemented their policy, nevertheless, I agree that the basic drivers, the considerations that the Saudis made when they made the decision to intervene in the Yemen conflict, which had started 6 months earlier, by the way. It was not the Saudis who started this. That they were correct in their assessment. The United States supported it. I think that we should still support it and see that the outcome has to be one that leaves Saudi Arabia as well as Yemen more secure than they were in late 2014, early 2015. The other point that I would make is that, again, we have this long-standing relationship with Saudi Arabia. We have that relationship for a number of reasons related to regional security and stability, and I don't believe that it's in our interest to abandon that relationship, which has served U.S. national security interests well for decades, that we should abandon it because we have a disagreement with them about the way they are approaching the conflict in Yemen. But again, I recognize that that is not a universally held view.
Let me ask each of you now to uh, focus a little bit more on the U.S. role. In each of these countries, the U.S. role has been, in some sense, problematic. Certainly, in Libya, there are some people who blame us for the whole mess. In Afghanistan, we are a major factor. In Yemen,
We were brilliant.
we were brilliant but didn't achieve anything. We in fact have tried to stay out of Yemen, keep it at arm's length. But in fact, we continue to operate there and continue to operate in particular against Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So, I mean, given how problematic the U.S. role has been historically in these places, is it wise to be counseling a stronger U.S. role rather than a weaker one? Let's try with Jonathan first.
I think it depends what the United States is doing. I see nothing to apologize for in what the United States did with the GNA, the Tripolitanians, to extirpate Islamic State control from Sirte and the Sirte Basin. I think that was enormously popular with Libyans, not just outside Libya. We can, I suppose, apologize for helping Libyans get rid of Gaddafi after they decided to get rid of him. After you had a uprising all over the country, I guess we could apologize for that and say, no, it was a mistake. We now think Gaddafi rule was a better idea. That wasn't our policy. In retrospect, I don't think it should have been our policy. So the Libyans, I think, who would blame us, it's absolutely great to blame the United States. We all can agree the United States is always worth blaming because the United States has a lot of power, potentially. At the particular moment that we're in now on Libya, if the United States can be both self-respectful and not prideful at the same time, we can be approaching every country. Egypt, how do you see this war ending? What's the solution? Emiratis, you really think you're going to have Haftar conquer the country? He's not even popular inside his coalition. They resent his corruption and his control. What's the deal here? And you try and quietly do a bilateral diplomacy with a whole lot of countries and see if there's a deal to be had to cease the foreign stimulation of the war. Now, is Haftar capable of being part of a political solution? I don't believe so. He's been given every chance to do it. So part of that involves having the folks who want to see alternatives to Muslim Brotherhood political pluralism or Turkey-dominated governments to see what kind of solutions they can live with that do not involve partition. And that ought to be some kind of devolution of some power and certainly some money to different portions of the country. So the East gets its share, Egypt gets some kind of buffer, but the country doesn't fall apart. Turkey gets some kind of oil or gas rights, but not all of them. Gets some jobs, but not all of them. The Egyptians are back in being able to get jobs. This is an economic deal. And the United States could be very forward-looking in trying to build out that economic deal. The biggest problem, I think, for the United States, if the United States did that at this point, would be Russia, because it may well not be in Russia's interests for the United States to succeed in trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, or simply align other countries. And so that gets back to this question of leading from behind, and whether other countries like Germany, for example, Algeria, for example, Egypt, for example, can come together in some kind of initiative, which the United States is part of, but is not taking the direct lead, although the United States has to take the lead in these bilateral moves. I believe transparency would make a huge difference. That is, if the United States were regularly saying, this is what the Emiratis are doing, this is what the Russians are doing, this is what the Turks are doing, this is what the Egyptians are doing, this is what the Sudanese are doing, and to bring that into New York, that would change the dynamics a lot. We've not done that lately. I think that would help. The message to the Emirati is very simple. Stop the drone attacks. You're killing civilians. You killed young military cadets, teenagers in training that Libya needed with these airstrikes. It has to stop. It has to stop now. The Turks, you say, you've got to stop importing fighters out of Syria. Has to stop now. And you go on from there.
Thank you. Marvin, in addition to commenting on the U.S. role.
How come he never gets another question?
Well, I think he did get. In addition to commenting on the U.S. role and whether it will be welcomed if it's strengthened in Afghanistan, I wonder if you could comment on what Jonathan just mentioned, which is the role of devolution and decentralization of power in Afghanistan. Is this a good route or not?
Yeah. Well, first, I've already been, I think, clear on the pivotal role that the United States and its allies play here and how things might change. I think we ought to look at the American role here not as a matter of certainly winning and not losing. We have, I don't know what the figure is exactly, 160,000 American troops stationed abroad at this time. And they're there for, if we had to generalize it, stabilization. It may very well be, as I argue here, for a reinvestment in Afghanistan, not with numbers of troops here. We're not talking about a surge. What we're talking about here is a way of stabilizing this so that there is the possibility of a better outcome and at least avoidance of the worst of the outcomes here. So what you want here, I think, is a sweet spot. And I think it's achievable, where you have the minimal force necessary to be able to assure that the functions that the U.S. military performs and provides the basis for non-military assistance as well, that remains, but that it is small enough at the same time not to incur heavy political costs in this country. That it's acceptable, just as it's acceptable to have troops in South Korea, in Germany, and all those other places where we've got 160,000 troops. Now, on the other, with respect to, there's a dirty word in Afghanistan, and it's called federalism. You mention that, and they say, oh, you're trying to break us up ethnically. I think we all know that the only way in which this can function as a polity is a much more decentralized, there's no question about that. But it has to be organic. It has to be something which emerges from the traditional institutions of the country and that they can flourish as long as there also is a modern state too, which does the things they can't do. And that's been the genius of Afghan politics. Have a strong enough central government to do those things that a national government must do, and to know how not to extend that influence into areas where it doesn't work or it's just simply not accepted. So there's a yes and a no. We can't impose, it would be impossible to impose this kind of federal system. Things don't break down that way. But I'll conclude with this. Then USIS once sent me to Peshawar to talk to the Mujahideen leaders, and that's when we had a real U.S. Foreign Affairs component, and to convince them here, to teach them what federalism meant as we knew it. And, they laughed in my face. It was it was a terrible experience.
Jerry, in addition to commenting on this decentralization question, two related issues that people in the audience have posed. On Yemen, wouldn't Saudi prefer a divided Yemen to one controlled entirely by the Houthis? And on the UAE, what is their objective in Yemen at this point?
And do you want me to answer the question about America?
And the question about America as well.
Yeah, very quickly on the U.S. and kind of as I mentioned earlier, that is the biggest concern I have about the United States policy position over the last 3 years is that we've been more or less absent from the conversation about Yemen. We have left it in the hands of our ambassadors to Yemen, which is fine. We've had two very good, competent ambassadors in that position, but we have not had the kind of senior level engagement that really demonstrates to either the Yemenis or our friends and partners in the region that we're serious about seeing an end to the Yemen conflict. And I think that that's been unfortunate. I think it's complicated the ability of the UN to really bring the parties back to the table and has undermined the political process, the political dialogue between those parties. The U.S. is the U.S. role in Yemen sometimes controversial? Absolutely. You mentioned that it has been heavily focused on the counterterrorism aspect, and that is somewhat true, but not as true. I think it's greatly exaggerated that the United States engagement in Yemen has been so heavily focused on CT. It's important, but we've done a lot of other things in Yemen over the years as well. And the other thing is, I would say, and I would kind of echo what Jonathan said here, and that is that a lot of people love to criticize the United States, and the United States has certainly done a number of things that are justify criticism. On the other hand, I think that many of those same people, as well as many others, understand and believe that the U.S. does play a critical role, and that the U.S. engagement is essential in order to try to achieve positive outcomes. So I think that in terms of how Yemenis, how other people in the region see the United States role right now, I think the biggest concern is our absence rather than the policies that we've tried to pursue. In terms of where, and I know there's a question about the Saudis, a question also about the Emiratis. Interestingly, I thought that certainly by the middle of 2019, the variance in views, the differences between Saudi and Emirati policy in Yemen were pretty apparent. The Emiratis, primarily because of their unhappiness with the Hadi government, and their unhappiness with the Hadi government was generated mostly by the participation of the Islah Party, which the Emiratis saw as a Muslim Brotherhood affiliate, and therefore, for the same reasons that they've taken the position on the GNA in Libya, they were determined not to support Hadi. But even beyond that, there are long-standing familial and historical ties between the UAE and South Yemen, and therefore that a lot of the Emirati investment in and interest in the South was related to these long-standing relations. And so it certainly seemed at the time that the Emiratis were far more comfortable with the idea of a divided Yemen than the Saudis were. In terms of where the Saudis are now, it's a bit of a loaded question. You know, would you prefer a divided Yemen or a Houthi-dominated a whole Yemen? The answer is neither of the above. That both of them would be anathema to the Saudis, primarily because a divided Yemen would be a Houthi-dominated North Yemen, or a Zaidi Shia-dominated North Yemen, which is problematic because it would be a North Yemen on their border that would be open to Iranian and Hezbollah influence. And a whole Yemen under Houthi control would be that kind of divided Yemen times two. So both of them unacceptable. What the Saudis want is a Yemen that is whole, and that while they have accepted the idea of Houthi participation in a Yemeni government, nevertheless would not be dominated by the Houthis. It would be open for other forces that would be more friendly and more accessible for the Saudis. So in the summer of 2019, the divisions between the UAE and Saudi Arabia were pretty apparent. I would say that as we come into the beginning of 2020, those differences have been more or less resolved. I think that the Emiratis have backed away from some of the policies that they were pursuing in 2018, 2019. They have more or less accepted Saudi leadership, I think, and are following the Saudi line, which is for a unified Yemen and a political resolution to the conflict.
Before I conclude, I just want to comment that this has been a great hour and a half. I have heard in many of your remarks two strains that are repeated. One is the importance of elite pacts. That is, that somehow you're going to have to get some sort of power sharing arrangements in order to end the wars. The other constant theme I hear is that the internationals, and in particular the US, can play a very strong role, even where they haven't been such a strong factor in provoking the civil wars as in Yemen. They can play a strong role, and a strong positive role, and that the US role should be thought of much more in terms of diplomatic engagement than military presence. So with that, let me draw us to a conclusion, and I assume we're reconvening after the coffee break at 11:15 for a session that will take a much more regional approach to the issues. Thank you.